Thank you for coming. I'm very excited about this celebration year. We are into our second month, and we'll be having lots of interesting events, programs, special events, exhibits, publications, and so on. I am going to turn it over to Francis Lowe, who has headed this event with Trish Ridgway, and I appreciate them putting this all together. And Francis will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kim. We just thought it would be really special to be out here with the paintings, so I hope everybody will bear with us and hope you can see. Marisa is not a stranger to Winchester. This is her third time doing this. I heard her the very first time. We were figuring, 2002. Some of you may remember. I think it was Handley's 80th, somewhere in there, celebration. And it was in the auditorium. It was. Pictures weren't out here yet. Then for one book, some of you may remember, we did The Monuments Men, the book Love, and we had a bag to talk about this again. We were out the MSD. And then we also had programs here. At that time, we did go down to see the vault. But we cannot do that today. I don't know what I told you. I'm sorry. It's just there's too much down there. It would not be safe for all of us to try to go there and back. But at the end of her presentation, Kim has put together slides of what it looks like. And so actually you're going to see it better than traipsing down there and back. Okay, Marisa has been, anyway, she was with the Corcoran. She'll tell you more about that. And now she's with the Smithsonian. And we're so happy that she would come and do this for us. And she brought her lovely husband, who's here somewhere. There he is back there. Thanks for coming too. Okay, so I'll turn it over to her to tell you all about it. It deals with everything in this room.
We are rapidly coming up. Okay. I am not an AV person, so. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, terrific. First of all, thank you very much for having me back for my third trip to Winchester, Virginia, and its lovely environs. And I have to say that the spectacle of you guys, everybody pitching in to get chairs in here, people moving around their seats, people offering seats next to each other, people just pitching in and helping is exactly the kind of spirit that brought the Corcoran to Winchester in 1942. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's very kind. So what I remember quite clearly about my visit in 2002 is a series of misfortunate events which ended up with my car being towed. It's a very long story, but very delightful, and everyone was so kind, and it was very funny. There's another part of that story that I'm not going to tell. But anyway, what I also would remember is that I wasn't wearing reading glasses at the time. So here come the glasses. What I will ask is that the people in the front will let me know if the slides have changed. And maybe even what they are. Because I can no longer see them, which is fine. So, how many of you have heard this talk before? Oh, what a relief. Oh no. Okay. It's going to sound familiar. Because the thing about history is that it sort of doesn't really change. At least this particular set of circumstances. So, I'd like to start out, again, by thanking everybody for the invitation. It's just your hospitality is very welcome and lovely. So our story begins the first week of December in 1941. The Corcoran Gallery of Art, the oldest and largest private art museum in Washington, was going about its daily business in a well-established rhythm of exhibitions and art classes and visitors, a rhythm developed over more than 75 years of service to the city. The Corcoran was founded in 1869, and from its earliest days and its first home, what is now the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution, it was an important component of Washington artistic life. The founder, William Wilson Corcoran, seen here, was a prominent Washington banker and philanthropist who also took the waters of Berkeley Springs, by the way. The founder was born and raised in Georgetown in Washington and made his fortune as a banker. Is anybody here old enough to remember Riggs Bank in DC? Oh, okay. It was originally called Corcoran and Riggs. William Wilson Corcoran and his partner Elijah Riggs founded the bank together in the 1840s, and eventually Riggs bought out Corcoran. Riggs bought out Corcoran and took his name off the building, but the story goes that William Wilson Corcoran was the sales guy. Not let me help you open your checking account and I'll give you a toaster, but like, let me sell you bonds to finance your railroad project kind of guy. And Elijah Riggs, his partner, was the guy who counted money. A lot of money. They made a lot of money. And they made a lot of money pretty quickly. And so he was able to retire from business at the age of 56 in 1854. As his personal wealth grew, he began to collect paintings and sculpture by both well and lesser-known American and European artists. His home on Washington's Lafayette Square, did it change? What is it? It's a house, okay, good. We're headed in the right direction. So his home on Lafayette Square in DC, right across from the White House, nice view of the White House, provided an impressive showcase for his growing collection. So William Wilson Corcoran traveled in Europe, he bought paintings, and this is a time when people who had, and it's true today, when you have a lot of money and you've taken care of your basic needs, you like to have nice things around you. It's not only to provide an aesthetic environment in your home, but it's also to show off. Well, look at me, I can afford this thing, can you? But it was a very modest kind of gallery that he had in his home on Lafayette Square. And a few times a week, visitors would come and be invited to view the works of art he had started to collect. And if they were lucky, they could sit and have tea with Mr. Corcoran, or perhaps a glass of Madeira, his favorite wine. However, does anybody have experience with buying too many things to fit in your home? Right? So William Wilson Corcoran had bought too many things to fit in his home, and even an addition that he put on the house wasn't sufficient. So William Wilson Corcoran's friend, the architect James Renwick, helped him design and build a separate gallery of art just 2 blocks from William Wilson Corcoran's home. What is it? Yep. All right, excellent news. Okay, this new building at the corner of 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, just across the street from the White House, was begun in 1859, but construction was interrupted by the Civil War and Mr. Corcoran's troubles as a Southern sympathizer. After delays caused by Mr. Corcoran's precarious political position and family tragedies, Mr. Corcoran finally formally established the Corcoran Gallery of Art in 1869, turning over the building, the bulk of his collection, and an endowment fund. The gallery opened to the public in 1874 and was quickly a destination of choice for visitors to the nation's capital. School children, international dignitaries, local residents, politicians, art lovers, and casual visitors alike all came to admire original works of art and, in addition, plaster casts of ancient sculpture. So, what happens next? They have too many things. So now we have to move again. What is it? Excellent, okay. So, as is usually the case, the museum outgrew its building and was forced to consider larger quarters elsewhere. The trustees were fortunate to secure a lot just a few blocks away at the corner of 17th Street and New York Avenue. The Corcoran moved into its new home in 1897 after several years of construction. The new building offered an opportunity to formalize the art school programs, expand the exhibition schedule, and collect works of art more actively. The gallery weathered the First World War, and by 1941 was still struggling with the Great Depression. During those Depression years, the Corcoran pledged to keep all of its staff members on the payroll, and as far as I was able to determine, never had to let anyone go. The outbreak of the war all over the world Oh.
His office.
Oh, Miniger Road. Okay, all right, I'm on it. Okay. The outbreak of the war all over the world had prompted some worry by the trustees about the safety of works of art. But by 1941, this is out of order. Okay, so we're starting to get through the Depression. The Corcoran has had a long history of service to the area. It had already hosted more than 700 exhibitions and provided instructions for hundreds of aspiring and amateur artists. So there are lots of people who came to study painting, to admire great works of art, to make their own copies of things, and to go off into the world to become artists or to teach art. So here we are in 1941, and the Corcoran's director, Cuthbert Powell, Miniger had been on the staff of the Corcoran Gallery for 50 years. He started in 1892 at the age of 15. At the age of 15 as a clerk, but then worked up his way up to director. My younger son is 15. He is working at the snack bar at the It's a job I fervently hope he does not retire from. Anyway. So he worked his way up to director, a job that he got in 1915 when his predecessor died in office. Mr. Miniger was active in every aspect of the institution's administration. And I think, so this is him at his desk, right? He's working at his desk, which survived for a long time, I think. Can anybody guess what this object is? It's hard to see, but it's It's closer to a book press. It's a letter press. And it was an old-fashioned way of making carbon copies of something, right? So before carbon paper, and I know you people remember rolling the carbon paper into the typewriter, but before you could do that, they had letterpress books where I don't understand the technology. I only understand the word press, right? Press, right? And then you got essentially a carbon copy. But over here, on the left-hand side, I'm sorry if you couldn't hear me for that interlude, but over here on the left-hand side are ledger books that Miniger was responsible for maintaining as the clerk, right? They recorded incoming letters, board of trustee minutes, paintings that had been purchased, and it was his job to make all of those entries and all of those ledgers. And it was my theory that this is why those materials survived for as long as they did, well, forever, because he knew how much work it was to make them, and I think he didn't ever want anybody to touch them. But anyway, he studied actively and learned about art, and you learn a lot about art when you work in an art museum, dealing with artists and students. So in this first week of December 1941, Mr. Miniger and his small professional staff had just installed an exhibition of the work of Jerome Myers, a prominent painter during the time whose painting Life on the East Side was already in the permanent collection of the Corcoran. Myers arrived on Monday the 1st to help install the exhibition and to give a lecture the following night to the art students. The show opened to the public on Thursday, December the 4th, without the big party we expect these days, but with decent reviews in the local papers. Also during that first week in December, Mr. Miniger met with George Hamilton, a prominent Washington lawyer and longtime trustee of the Corcoran, as well as Edward Redfield, a well-known Pennsylvania painter, and his wife. Redfield and Miniger were quite close, and at one point, Redfield came to the Corcoran for a visit and left to go back to his home in Pennsylvania, and Miniger wrote him a letter that said, "You left your checkbook here. Is there any money? Or should I just send it to you?" In terms of the school, the Corcoran School of Art was in the middle of its 55th season. The art students were busy with the end of the semester, finishing up projects in anticipation of the approaching winter break. Total registration for the year in regular classes, which were given during the day and at night, was nearly 500. Students were enrolled in classes in drawing and painting, from life, and from the antique casts on display in the gallery's atrium. And we know what I mean by antique casts. So these are plaster casts that were made after Greek and Roman and Renaissance sculpture that you could purchase as teaching tools. So they're three-dimensional, right, and probably to scale. And you could purchase these plaster casts and set them up in your museum or what have you, and people could see what the Pietà looked like, or Greek and Roman sculptures, and students could get an idea of how that modeling worked. So they're not original works of art, but they were valuable tools for teaching. In any case, sculpture classes were taught as well, portrait life modeling, and composition in clay and plaster and wood. 1941 was also the first year that, through an arrangement between the Corcoran and George Washington University students who wanted to work toward a bachelor's or master's degree could take their studio classes at the Corcoran. In previous years, the Corcoran had offered an informal course of study that did not result in a degree. Now students would have the option of receiving regular academic instruction at GW while pursuing their artistic endeavors in the Corcoran studio spaces. This becomes ironic later. The annual show and sale of work by Corcoran alumni had just closed on November 30th, 1941. The Corcoran, being one of the White House's closest neighbors, had a cordial relationship with President and Mrs. Roosevelt. Eleanor was a frequent visitor to the Corcoran, and the Corcoran exhibited her husband's naval ship models. It may have been the White House that suggested that the future Queen of Malaysia visit the Corcoran on Saturday, December the 6th. We know from Mr. Mingarod's daily diary that she was expected sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock that afternoon, and I, for one, am disappointed that we don't have a picture of Her Royal Highness in the galleries. Although many Americans feared that the U.S. would be pulled into the growing worldwide conflict, the events of Sunday morning, December the 7th, came as a grave shock. The surprise attack was announced by radio as people in Washington were returning from church and morning spent with family. We don't know when Mr. Mingarode or the trustees first heard the news, but I imagine their thoughts soon turned to the Corcoran Gallery and the objects in their care. Newspaper?
Yes.
Okay. Students? All right, students. All right, we talked about them. Newspaper. And then Washington Monument? Yep. Okay. All right. So instantly, Washington was a different place, like all of a sudden, right? In the days and weeks and months and years, the city underwent a dramatic transformation. Thousands of new defense and wartime employees flooded the city, putting a strain on housing and office spaces alike. Civic authorities would soon put into place emergency measures like blackouts, air raids, and rationing, just like those in effect all over the country. Military personnel would travel to and from the area, some on temporary assignment to the Defense Department, some on leave, and others recuperating from injuries. Hospitals, temporary office space, housing, and transportation centers were all built in record time. And actually, there was a hospital across the street from the Corcoran. The building there is like right now it's like a 1970s thing, but before that it was, I want to say like a rooming house maybe, and they put wounded soldiers there, and the Corcoran would sometimes have soldiers come over, the ones that were more mobile, come over and like spend an afternoon just sort of resting their eyes on lovely works of art. So all of those things happened, but in the first few days following Pearl Harbor, none of that had happened yet. The city was left to make its way through the initial shock and fright to a plan. We must have a plan. It's got to be a plan. Mr. Mingarode seems to have gone along about his daily routine on Monday, the 8th of December, and the rest of that week, the staff installed the next exhibition. One of the staff members gave a lecture on Wednesday night on French art of the 19th century. But on December 11th, just 4 days after the bombing, the newly appointed special committee of the trustees met at the Corcoran to formulate a plan, because you can't do anything without a committee. Has to be a committee, right? The committee implemented some emergency measures: additional watchmen, additional chemical fire extinguishers, an air raid shelter, and 2 additional men were engaged to sleep in the building. And actually, that wasn't such a hardship because the building was actually built with an apartment in it. On the first floor, in what later became the finance office, You could tell that there had been a parlor, and there were built-in bookshelves, and the bathroom back there had a claw-footed bathtub. Like, so there was an actual living space, so the guys weren't forced to like sleep on the floor in the galleries. The committee also considered the problem of the enormous amount of glass in the building skylights, because the Corcoran was built with these just giant skylights on the roof. It was all glass. And the idea was that, you know, natural light came filtering down into the gallery spaces, and all the way into the museum's basement where art students were making art. And so there was still even natural light in the basement. So there's a lot of glass, but they immediately rejected the idea because it was just going to be too much money and too fraught to try to put any kind of emergency measures under the skylights. At the same meeting, it was decided to investigate possible remote repositories for works of art if they had to be evacuated from the gallery. And meanwhile, basically every art museum in the country is having the same conversations. The National Gallery, which had not yet formally opened but still had objects in its care. I think the Phillips collection in DC also had some emergency measures. So Mr. Minnigerode and Mr. Parsons, who was the assistant director, set out by car on December 11th, and they went to Frederick, Maryland. They looked in the phone book, and they found 2 storage companies. When Mr. Minnigerode and Parsons asked a local real estate agent about the 2 properties, they were told that neither was likely to be fireproof, one of the gallery's requirements. And in the course of further conversation, it was determined that the agent, Mr. Potts, had been a schoolmate of Mr. Minnigerode's, and there is nothing I like better than the small world story. These guys had gone to school together, and here they are trying to figure out this problem. So Mr. Potts offered his services as a guide to Frederick, and the 3 men set out for the Maryland Institute of the Deaf, now the Maryland School for the Deaf, on the edge of Frederick, closest to Washington. One of the staff showed them around and pointed out some small storage rooms in the basement that could become available. The staff member promised to have the superintendent of the school communicate with the secretary of the Board of Trustees, who happened to be the helpful Mr. Potts. From there, the party moved on to Hood College, where they saw some small rooms and a new library building, and were encouraged to write to the college president about their availability. The report for the day points out that there was an airport approximately 1 mile from Hood, and although it was small, it might be enlarged. Why is the airport close by the problem?
That's what they're going to hit.
Right, exactly. So they were reluctant to put something in an area that could conceivably be someday bombed. So they come home from Frederick, and the next day they set out again, and this time they go to Leesburg. So there they met with the district attorney, I don't know why. Oh, yes, Charles F. Harrison, who was a longtime resident of Leesburg. Mr. Harrison showed them the Leesburg town building where the 2nd floor was available. The 1st floor of the building served as the headquarters for the police and fire department of the town, so it would seem to be a secure and suitable location. However, the space was too large, and according to the day's notes, a fire trap. The 2nd floor of the local jail was also investigated, but it was found to be lacking, as it was a steel and concrete garage. More promising was the Thomas Balch Library, a brick structure with good-sized rooms and access. The president of the Library Association thought it might be possible to make the necessary arrangements, including the presence of a watchman. And on their way out of town, Mr. Minnigerode and Mr. Parsons also checked out 2 private homes, but one nice lady had no space, and the other's home was too secluded. It isn't clear from the records when or how the deal with the Balch Library fell through, but by December 15th, Mr. Minnigerode and Mr. Parsons were on the road to Winchester. First, they stopped by the Foxcroft School outside of Middleburg. The head of the school, Miss Charlotte Nolan, was out hunting. As you do when you are running a girls' school. She was out hunting. But her secretary was very helpful and showed the 2 men the only space she thought might be available. The space was on the top floor of the girls' dormitory, a brick building, but with wooden beams and supports. Deeming the space a considerable fire hazard, the 2 men moved on to Winchester, which actually really raises the question for me, what were the girls doing in a building that was an apparent fire hazard? On their arrival in Winchester, they first went to see, I know you're psyched, we finally got into Winchester, right? All right, they first went to see Nelson Page, the postmaster. Mr. Page and the Reverend Clifford Grimm were already acquainted with Corcoran's director, since Mr. Minigrode had helped them have a portrait of George Washington painted. This is not that unusual, right? Like, somebody wants a painting of George Washington, and what they probably did is they asked Minigrode who could copy a famous painting, like, who could make them a decent copy of Gilbert Stuart, right? So Mr. Minigrode apparently helped them do that. Mr. Page called the apple storage firms, but it was quickly determined that the cold storage needed for apples would not be suitable for the gallery's purposes. Although, I don't know, maybe it would have been fun. Then why would we be here today? While talking to Mr. Page, the two gallery staff noticed the Handley Library. Oh wait, I think I'm behind in my slides. What's that? Oh, all right. Noticed the Handley Library across the street and went to make inquiries. The only room the librarian, Vernon Eddy, could offer would not work. But it was Mr. Eddy who showed Mr. Minigrode and Mr. Parsons over to the Handley School, as they described it, quote, on the outskirts of town, completely removed from other structures, surrounded by an athletic field and open fields. Once they were at the school, they were introduced to the school superintendent, Garland Quarles, who showed them several rooms in the school's basement. Does that sound familiar? Well, okay. Showed them several rooms in the school's basement. These were the best spaces the Corcoran people had seen yet and were in an ideal location. The search was over. As was described in the committee minutes, quote, Winchester is not an industrial town. It has no factories, no airplane plant or airport, no army camp or munitions factory. The room in question is amply large for our purpose. It measures 24 by 28, with the ceiling about 15 feet above the floor. It is almost entirely below the surface of the ground. It appears to be very strongly constructed, solid concrete and brick walls, and the ceiling of reinforced concrete. The Corcoran folks brought back the Winchester Public Schools handbook, which described in proud detail the merits of the school and its facilities. Handley High School, as I'm sure most of you know, was made possible by the posthumous generation of Judge John Handley. His bequest of $250,000 provided funds for school buildings and the Handley Library, and to this day is used on special projects undertaken by the Winchester Public Schools. Construction of the high school building was begun in 1921 and completed in? Thank you. Anybody know how much it cost? I think I hear murmuring. Somebody put up your hand. I want to see a hand. All right, right here. Yes. My notes say more than $750,000, which I think was my way of trying to put the word million in there. But yeah, so that's a lot of money. The building was an impressive civic project, and its prominent place on a high point in the town's geography made it then, as now, a local landmark. Oh yeah. I don't know. Anyway, so the building was an impressive. Okay, the school can be seen from miles high on the hill, and the Corcoran had, in effect, decided to hide its treasures in plain sight. Mr. Quarles was immediately found to be enormously helpful. He secured the necessary permissions from the school board and the trustees of the Handley Fund and placed the room at the Corcoran's disposal without any charge, under the condition that the school would assume no responsibility, incur no expenses, and that the Corcoran would pay for the watchman, which is really reasonable. On July 3rd, so now we're nearly a month later, past the Pearl Harbor attack, Mr. Corcoran Tom, one of the trustees on the special committee, went with Mr. Minigrode to Winchester to make his own assessment of the situation, which he reported to the committee. Quote, if the trustees feel that it is desirable to store our irreplaceable treasures in a quiet country town, apart from factories, munitions plants, etc., and near enough for us to exercise frequent supervision, this committee feels that we could not hope to secure a better place. But first, there was some work to be done to make the room suitable. For one thing, it needed a steel door with a combination. Although it was suddenly very difficult to get these things, the Corcoran was lucky enough to acquire one second-hand safe, or steel door, with a combination through the York Safe and Lock Company. The room also needed a brick floor, ventilation, electric lights, an alarm system, racks for storage, and a telephone. All of these tasks were accomplished fairly quickly, and the Corcoran wasted little time in determining what was to be sent. Although the room wasn't expected to be ready until February, the Corcoran staff had already removed a number of the most important works of art and placed them in storage. Their places were filled by other paintings so that there wouldn't appear to be any gaps or holes. The gallery's rotunda, its main exhibition space at the time, was actually left the way that it was, with the understanding that the paintings would be removed if the danger became more imminent. On Saturday, February 21st, 1942, 3 vehicles, one van from security storage and 2 smaller wagons from Garfinkel's department store. Anybody? Garfinkel's? All right, there you go. It's where my mother bought her wedding dress. Came to the gallery and took 48 paintings, 4 Gothic tapestries, and a vase rug to Winchester. The total value of the works was placed at $1,155,000. 3 trucks were used because the insurance company would not allow more than $400,000 worth to be placed on any one truck. Mr. O'Connor, the Corcoran's curator, supervised the loading, unloading, and checking the new ADT alarm system. The first watchman, who was paid $75 a month for 12-hour shifts, went on duty immediately. The town postmaster, Nelson Page, came over to the school and inspected the vault before it was closed. Notes for the day say, a sealed copy of the combination to the vault has been placed in Mr. Quarles' care and is in his safe at the Handley School, and in case of emergencies, Messrs. Quarles and Page are authorized to break the seal and enter the vault. So, with hindsight, we know how this story ends, right? We know that the U.S. and its allies emerged victorious. But in the spring of 1942, none of that is guaranteed. Nobody has any idea if the nation's new enemies will reach its shores. The Corcoran was right near the White House. If the Germans had decided to make it had made it that far and bombed the White House, it's almost certain the Corcoran would have been destroyed as well. So this was a very real fear these guys had, and they did everything they could to be sure that there would be some responsible party if they perished. So let's see what they sent. All right. I don't think I can do this with this many people in the room, but so I'm just going to sort of read a list of some of the things that they sent, which you can see around the room, and these are all to scale, right? These are all life size. These are the size that the actual objects were. When this installation was done in 2009, it was based on information that they got from the gallery, and in 2009 it might have been transparencies and not digital files, possibly. But in any case, Stewart's, George Washington, Edward G. Malbone, Portrait of the Artist, Colonel Richardson is around here somewhere. There's a Copley, there's a John Singer Sargent. That's the Sargent. The Thomas Aiken's The Pathetic Song is back there. The Winslow Homer Light in the Sea is next to it. William Blacken's Luggins and Regards, I think that's always really an interesting choice to me because it really is a very nice painting, but I'm not sure I would have said it was like top 20. It's a lovely painting. George Bellows' 42 Kids, that's definitely one of the masterpieces. Edmund Tarbell's Josephine and Mercy, which is down that hallway a little bit. George Looks, Woman with a Black Cat. I don't know about this. So, but here's the thing, right? Like you're in charge of, the Corcoran probably had, at the time, like, I don't know, 10,000 objects that it was taking care of, maybe? I mean, but to be fair, a lot of those would have been works of art on paper. So when you're talking about like paintings and sculpture, the number is really much lower. But still, they had to figure out in a short amount of time, like, you can't save everything. And really, no choice you make is going to be bad. There are no bad choices, right? Because there are a lot of really great things. But there are things they couldn't move because they're just too big, or they were too prominent, and somebody would notice that they were gone. The Corcoran owned a great painting by Frederick Edward Church called Niagara, which is like one of the most iconic paintings of the 19th century. It is enormous. If they moved it, somebody would notice and ask questions. You know, the Luxembourg Gardens, maybe, you know, maybe it was somebody's favorite, but nobody was probably going to make inquiries about it if it was gone. There are other paintings. So those first are American paintings that the Corcoran had acquired during sort of the normal course of its business, some of which they bought new, right, from the artists themselves. But we also sent out works from the William Andrews Clark collection, which had come to the Corcoran in 1926 and was a collection primarily of European paintings and sculpture, but also other kinds of objects, so lace and rugs and Maiolica and other kinds, like all kinds of all kinds of things. He had a very eclectic collection. So they did take a number of Netherlandish, Belgian, French paintings as well, and there's some like further down that way are some of those paintings. Again, nice paintings. Oh yeah, those are really nice paintings. All right, so they sent Corot's and Van Goyen landscapes and paintings that have a lot of cattle in them, and fields and haystacks. And the oldest painting in the collection, a triptych by Andre Vivani from the 14th century. Oh. So by the summer of 1942, the war situation seemed to be getting worse, and the staff was increasingly fearful for the safety of the gallery and its collections. Insurance would be prohibitively expensive and difficult to obtain, and the trustees didn't want to send any more objects to Winchester, so it was decided to remove some of the remaining works of art from the exhibition galleries to the gallery's sub-basement when a real bombing threat was received. Over the next 2 years, Corcoran staff members made trips to Winchester on a regular basis. And it did occur to me as my husband and I were driving out here on 66, how long did that trip take? Like, what was the, like, it's not, I mean, it's not the version of 66, I'm with, like, you know, my husband's doing 80. He was like, oh, that first number's an 8, maybe I should slow down. So, like, I want to know, like, how long did it take these guys to get out here? I mean, I'm sure it was a decent road from D.C. out this way, but can't imagine they were doing 80. In any case, so can anybody guess what the biggest problem that they had with things with storing things here? What's the biggest problem they had? The biggest threat to the collections? Yep. Pardon?
Going for the steps.
Oh, like I'm going to drop this thing? That would be my fear. That would be my personal fear. But they were young and strapping, and I don't think that's not it. But I like the answer. All right, what does humidity lead to? Mold. There it is, right? So their big fear was mold. It's very glamorous, right? It's very glamorous stuff. So they had these dryettes, which were devices suggested by the Department of Agriculture and containing calcium chloride, and they were installed in the summer of 1942 to combat the problem with some success, right? However, constant vigilance over the condition of the works of art necessitated frequent trips to Winchester. On one visit in September of 1942, the curator wanted to bring a painting out into the sun to air it out, but there were school children around and he decided to wait. I mean, I have to say that if you're like, 6 or 7, no, they wouldn't have been 6 or 7, they wouldn't have been school, like high school kids, you're a high school kid, and you're just doing your thing in the courtyard, and here comes a dude in a suit with a painting from the basement. Maybe there are questions to be asked. So anyway, the records that we have are full of notes about these visits, and they generally follow the same pattern. The hygrometer reading was taken, which measures the humidity. Paintings were inspected for mold and dampness. The rugs and tapestries were inspected for bugs. More calcium chloride was added to the dryettes and the vault was closed up again. Any bugs that were found that might be a danger to the objects were captured. and brought back to Washington for interrogation. In 1943, the Corcoran staff discovered the hard way that locks have to be oiled. And they weren't able to get the door open and had to come back another day with a locksmith. So just after D-Day in June of 1944, Mr. Quarles was informed that the gallery might be moving its treasures in the fall. The entry in the logbook for July 19, 1944 reads, "In view of the wartime paper shortage and the probable early return of the valuables to Washington, instead of purchasing another quire of paper for this record, further entries will be made on the back of paper already purchased. Please turn the folder upside down and continue reading." After more than 2.5 years in secret storage in Winchester, the Corcoran's works of art were returned to the Corcoran in October of 1944 in several vans. The Corcoran had spent about $5,000 a year on the expenses associated with the arrangement, including 3 watchmen, insurance, trips back and forth, telephone service, burglar alarms, etc. Paintings? Rug. Oh yeah, it's a nice rug. Letter. Okay. Thank you. So early in 1942, when arrangements with Handley were being finalized and the space was being readied, the Corcoran already knew that Mr. Quarles was invaluable to them. In February of 1942, Mr. Minigorode asked Nelson Page to inquire of Mrs. Quarles what kind of gift they might present to him in appreciation. Mr. Page reported that Mrs. Quarles thought a watch would be quite nice. In thanking the gallery for his gift, which was a watch, Mr. Quarles said, "I want to convey to you and to the board of directors of the Corcoran Gallery of Art my sincere thanks for the splendid gift which you presented to me last Saturday. I appreciate it more than I can tell you. I want to assure you, however, that whatever effort I expended in taking care of your work here has been done without any idea of compensation or reward. I realize that my efforts were not only on behalf of the Corcoran Gallery of Art, but in behalf of the American public, and I certainly do not want you to hesitate to call on me for any assistance which I can render. We are all very happy to cooperate." So, that is where our story ends. And although the Corcoran, as it existed then and existed until about 10 years ago, no longer exists, in the name of its memory, I would like to thank Winchester again for being there for an important group of paintings and to make sure that our nation's cultural history survived in a difficult time. And I also would like to thank you for having me here tonight.